Hi guys, so this is going to be the video about body paragraph development using the TEAL method. So I've sent you this Prezi to either look at, and I also included the PDF version just in case for some reason you can't access the Prezi. But I'm going to basically go over and explain this a little bit more because I think it's helpful to have an explanation in addition to this written visual. So we know that we're looking at body paragraphs, and if you've read the AGR chapters on essay structure, you know that body paragraphs are a really important part of our essay. This is where we include all of our explanations and examples to help support the thesis that we are arguing for or that we are communicating in our essay. And so each body paragraph begins with a topic sentence, and this is usually the first sentence of the paragraph. Now, I say usually because there's no rule that says it has to be the first sentence of the paragraph. However, for a class like this in English 100B, I would recommend making the topic sentence your first sentence of the body paragraph, just to make it very clear and easily identifiable for a reader. And so it is probably going to be your first sentence of the paragraph. As I said, your body paragraph is going to contain support that's going to help prove your point. So basically what the body paragraphs are doing is they are advancing specific aspects of your thesis statement. Okay, so like in the example from the video about effective thesis statements, we looked at this idea of someone arguing that social media was negatively impacting the mental health in their community, and the supporting points they listed, because they had a listing thesis, was that peers were comparing themselves to one another. So this idea of recognition from their peers, this idea of feeling pressure to have success or to have status, right? And so, for example, one paragraph might focus on how people are comparing themselves to their peers, and therefore it's causing them to feel badly or insecure, right? So that's advancing one specific part of the writer's thesis statement, and they should only be talking about comparing themselves to peers in that body paragraph. So this is really important to remember. Each of your body paragraphs should only focus on one topic. You should not talk about more than one idea within a single body paragraph. Now, you should have multiple examples, but all of these examples should all be about that one idea. So for example, this writer will most likely have multiple examples about people comparing themselves on social media to other people. But all of the examples should only be about comparing, and they shouldn't talk about status and success yet, because those are different topics, right? So remember, multiple examples are good and they're needed for the body paragraphs, but only one topic at a time, okay? And it should be really clear to the reader how the topic connects back to your thesis statement, okay? Because the body paragraphs are supposed to help us understand how your argument or how your main idea is developing. So here is TEAL. This is the acronym that I like to use for organization of the body paragraphs, as far as for guiding questions, which we'll look at in the next slide, for things that you can keep in mind in terms of how you can develop each of these points. So we have topic sentence, example, analysis, and link to thesis. And it should go in this order. There are other acronyms out there that other instructors use that are basically the same as this, but with just different language. So you may have learned a different acronym for a different class. And if you're comfortable with that acronym, I know AXIS is one, and there's a few others. So if you are familiar with a different acronym, feel free to keep using that development system that you already have. But I think this is a really effective way to develop your body paragraphs. And so I would also encourage you to give this a try as well. So let's look more closely at each part of TEAL. Now for the topic sentence, it's really important, like I mentioned earlier, that your topic sentence references your thesis statement. So here's an example. If the thesis statement is, Shakespeare's Othello demonstrates the danger of trusting those closest to oneself, then the topic sentence should reference that main idea from the thesis statement by saying, one way in which Shakespeare's Othello suggests one's closest allies are not to be trusted is ... So this would be the beginning of the topic sentence. And you can see that they say one way, which makes clear to the reader, okay, they're introducing just one idea. They're introducing just one aspect of this argument. And then they repeat what the argument is. So we're reminded as a reader that this writer is arguing that Shakespeare's play Othello suggests or implies that, you know, a person's closest allies or a person's closest friends are actually the ones that shouldn't be trusted, as opposed to enemies or those on the outside, right? So the framework and the language here is really clear in cueing the reader that we're being introduced to just one idea to focus on, and they repeat their argument, which helps us be constantly reminded of what the writer is trying to prove or communicate in the essay. Okay, so you always want to start by referencing your thesis. Now, the next step is to provide the one specific idea that you're going to be developing in the paragraph. So in this example, the writer might continue with, through the characterization of Othello's confidant, Iago. Now you can see here, this is just one idea. So the writer's going to be focusing on how Iago as a character that exists in this play, that character himself is proof that one's ally should not be trusted. Okay, so with the two parts together, the finished complete topic sentence would be, one way in which Shakespeare's Othello suggests one's closest allies are not to be trusted is through the characterization of Othello's confidant Iago. Okay, so they start by referencing the thesis statement, and they're really just repeating exactly what the thesis statement says, right? They change a few words, they change demonstrates to suggests, but other than that, the language is pretty identical, and that's totally fine. I would suggest changing, like they did in this example, a few words now and then, just so it's not too repetitive. But if you keep key language, like closest allies, right, that's fine. And there's some words that you just can't change. Like we have to say Shakespeare and Othello. We have to say this idea of trusted, right? Sometimes you have to use the same words because you have to accurately communicate your idea, and that's fine. But when you can change some words just to avoid being repetitive, please do so. But otherwise, just do keep in mind, it's fine to repeat your argument because you're reminding the reader of, this is my main idea in my essay, and it's important to remind your reader of that. Now, we also see framework like one way in which, before we go to the argument. This is really good signaling for readers so that we can keep in mind, you know, what's happening. We're looking at just one idea. In their second topic sentence, they might say something like, another way in which Shakespeare's Othello shows that those closest to a person should be questioned, or one should be skeptical of those closest to them, something like that, right? So you could start a second topic sentence with another way, right? The third one might be like a third way, right? And I know that might sound kind of basic, but it's actually a good practice, at least just to start that way, and then you might change the language later. But I think it's a good idea to start that way so that you can also be reminding yourself, I'm only talking about one idea right now. I should only focus on one idea that shows the reader how my argument is true, okay? And then remember, you should specifically state what that idea is, just like they did here in green, okay? Now with examples, which should come basically right after your topic sentence, you might have a sentence or two after the topic sentence just contextualizing the topic a bit more, but we do want to get into the examples pretty quickly within the body paragraph. Okay, so examples can be different things. They can be direct quotations. So for our first project, you might be directly quoting Adichie or Anzaldúa or Brown. That would be totally fine, and at some point you should directly quote one of them, right? You could paraphrase Adichie, Anzaldúa, or Brown, and to paraphrase means to take a direct quotation from somebody and to put it into your own words. So you might take a quotation from Adichie, interpret it, put it in your own words, and then you'll still cite it. Now, if you do paraphrase, do make sure that you are maintaining the idea from the author accurately. Okay, sometimes when we change the words into our own words, it's important that we keep in mind that we're not losing the actual meaning that the author intended. So do make sure that you're maintaining that intended meaning from the author. And if you have questions about whether you're doing that, feel free to ask me. Examples can also be personal examples, right? So personal stories. And for this essay, it's going to be really important and crucial that you are providing those. Now, like I said, these can be as detailed as you're comfortable with, right? You don't have to go into detail that you're not comfortable sharing with the class, but you should provide some type of personal example, probably at least once per paragraph, for both options. If you're talking about option 2, then these will be more personal examples of you reflecting on how you've accidentally or unintentionally upheld single stories, or personal reflections of why it's important for it to have a balance of stories. If you're writing for option 1 and you're writing about yourself, then of course these personal examples are much clearer as how to go about them, right? You'll be telling stories and experiences you've had with having a single story projected onto you, and then you'll also be telling your personal stories about your balance of stories. Now, if you're writing for option 1, but you're writing about somebody else, you'll be telling their personal examples, which should come from the informal interview you should be having with that person. And of course, you should have their consent to tell certain stories, okay? Now, these can also be reasons. Now, when I say reasons, these are basically just specific explanations that you give for something, okay? So for example, it usually comes after the word because, like we've talked about. So if I say single stories are negative and often impact people in a negative way, I should have a reason to back that up, right? So these reasons can come from Adichie, they can come from observations I've had, they can have from other articles that I've read or books that I've read or movies that I've watched, but I should have specific reasons, okay? So there's a lot of different types of examples that you can use. The important thing is that you're explicit in describing them and that you're very, very specific. I know I sound like a broken record, but I just want to make sure that it's really clear. When you're providing examples, you need to be specific, because if you offer a vague example and you don't describe it and you don't really talk about how it's related to the topic sentence, the reader is not going to understand why this example is being brought up, okay? So it's really important that you're specific. And when you're being specific, any reader should be able to understand what you're communicating in terms of how the example relates to the topic sentence, okay? Now, no matter what type of example you use, make sure your support shows your topic sentence and it's relevant. So that's what I was just talking about with being specific. The reader should be able to see how your example relates back to the topic sentence. Make sure you also introduce each example and contextualize it. So if you are getting it from, let's say, Adichie, you should introduce Adichie. You should say, according to Chimamanda Adichie, in her TED Talk, The Danger of a Single Story, she asserts that, and then you can put your quote, right? Now, if you're talking about your own personal example, you should contextualize it. So before diving into the story, you might provide context like, you know, for example, when I was in high school, during my senior year, I experienced someone projecting a single story onto me, or something like that, just so the reader can kind of place when and where this is happening before you actually tell the story. So introduction and contextualization is really important, okay, whether it's a personal example or you're quoting or paraphrasing from a text that we read. Now, you also want to make sure that you provide in-text citations, and we'll look at this more in the MLA video. But you see an example here, right? So you see this introduction, Gonzalez argues, and then we have a quote, and then in the parentheses, we have Gonzalez, and then a page number. For MLA, the period always goes on the outside of the parentheses. You're not going to put it here inside the quote. It's going to go at the end of the sentence, which is after the parentheses. You'll always put the author's last name and the page number. Now, this writer actually could have chosen to just put parentheses 8 parentheses because they mentioned the author's name here. Technically, it's not wrong to put the author's name again. If you want to be safe and you're not sure, just go ahead and put their name, right? But it's just considered redundant because they already said Gonzalez. But again, we'll talk about this more in the MLA video, okay? Now for analysis, these are just some questions you can keep in mind when you're developing your explanations and your specific analysis for why an example is relevant and significant to the topic, okay? So one question is, how does this example help the reader understand your topic sentence? How, right? That's the key word. So you want to come up with different reasons for why this example is, 1, relevant to your topic sentence, 2, why is it important, right? And 3, how does it show the topic sentence, okay? And that's kind of what this next part is as well. What specific parts of this example show your topic sentence? So if you're looking at a direct quote, look for specific words in that quote. Look at the language, really dissect the language. So if we go back to this quote, just for an example, emotional appeal does for readers what many other appeals cannot, and that is influence them to come to your conclusion on their own terms through their own experiences, right? That's a pretty chunky quote, and therefore the writer should pull out some key language. For example, they might zero in on this idea experiences and connect it to emotional appeal. They might say, here the author clarifies that the reason emotional appeal or pathos is so strong is because it taps into an audience member's own personal experiences that they can connect to the emotional aspect of the argument. Something like that, right? So you want to pull out language from the quote itself so that you can provide that as instances wherein the reader can see the relationship to the topic sentence, okay? So anytime you use a direct quote, please dissect the language in that quote while you're explaining the meaning, okay? And then lastly, you should look at what is important about this example. So if this is a personal example that you're giving, what's important about this experience that you've had? What were the major takeaways or insights for you, and how does this connect to your topic sentence? If it's a direct quote or you're paraphrasing something, consider what is the most important thing about this quote. What can someone learn about this quote, and how does it connect to your topic sentence? So the most important thing with analysis is making sure that it's very clear how it connects back to your topic sentence. And then we have link to thesis at the end, okay? So this is going to come at the end of the paragraph, okay? But I'm going to skip ahead really quick to show you something, okay? You're going to have multiple examples per paragraph, and I mentioned that earlier. You should have multiple examples per paragraph. So here's an example. Let's say you have 4 examples in one body paragraph. The analysis for each example is going to come directly after that example. And then when you're done with that analysis, you can move on to the second example. And then you'll do the analysis just for that example. And then you can move on to the third example. do the analysis for just that third example, and then you can move on to the fourth example, analysis for the fourth example, and then at the very end of that body paragraph, after you've done all the examples and analysis, then you'll do the link to thesis. Okay? So I just wanted to clarify that before we talk about the link to thesis, that the example and analysis should be completely developed before you do this. So the link to thesis is at the very end of the body paragraph. Okay? So questions to keep in mind with this are, how does this paragraph as a whole, right, so including the topic sentence and the support you've just developed, how does it help the reader understand your thesis statement? So remember, the body paragraph is just one aspect of your full thesis statement. Okay, so now you're kind of taking the time to explain to the reader, here's why all of this helps you understand my full argument, okay, or my full idea. How does your paragraph, the topic sentence and the support with your examples and analysis, how does it show your thesis statement? What is important for the reader to understand about the relationship or the connection between this paragraph and your thesis statement? Okay, this is really important. We want to make sure that by the end of your paragraph, it should be crystal clear to the reader why all of this was significant for you to take the time and describe. It should be really clear how it connects back to your thesis statement. Okay. Okay, so this is just a reminder. We're kind of just reiterating what we've talked about. Each body paragraph will have its own varying lengths and number of examples. There is no magic number or quote unquote correct number for how many examples you should have or for how long a paragraph should be. Okay, I will give you some ideas and guidelines to follow in case you're someone who likes to have a ballpark kind of number in the next slide, but there is no right number or right length. Okay, the important thing is that every paragraph includes each topic in TEAL. So every paragraph must have a topic sentence. You must have multiple examples. Each example must have thorough and specific analysis, and there should be a link to the thesis at the end of the paragraph. Okay, so even though the numbers of examples may vary in each paragraph, you might not have 4 examples in every paragraph, right? You might have 4 in one, 2 examples in another paragraph, and then maybe you have 6 or 7 examples in another paragraph, right? That's fine. But you should include as many examples as necessary in order to fully illustrate your point, okay? How will you know if it's enough, right? You'll know if it's enough, one, from feedback. So we're going to get feedback in our peer review workshop and in conferences, and you have the opportunity to go to the writing center, right? So that's one way to know if a reader tells you, I feel like you need more examples to really show the idea you're talking about, right? Or they might say, I think this is enough examples, but you need to develop your analysis for each example more, okay? So that's one way. Another way is by rereading your paragraph after taking a little break from it. So sometimes when we're in the middle of writing, we're too close to the draft and we can't see in that moment. We're kind of lost in our own writing, right? This happens to me all the time. Sometimes you just need to take a little break, you know, go do something else, do a different assignment or watch a TV show or cook or just do something that's not the paper, and then return to the paragraph, reread it out loud to yourself. I know this might seem weird, but it's really helpful to read out loud so that you can hear it from a reader's perspective. Read the paragraph out loud to yourself and ask yourself, does this make sense? Does this show the point I'm trying to make, or are you feeling lost? If you're feeling lost, that's probably a sign, like your gut is telling you there's either not enough examples to clarify the point, or the analysis is too vague, right? So something's off, and you can kind of figure this out by reading out loud to yourself, okay? And then if you're not sure how to improve it, you can see me in office hours, you can make a writing center appointment, right? It doesn't mean you have to approach revising it alone, but that's just one way you can kind of start to identify where something is off, okay? So just make sure every example receives specific and in-depth analysis. Now back to this. Like I said, analysis will always come directly after its example. You'll introduce an example, provide the example, and then provide about 3 to 4 sentences of analysis. Now, this is not a rule. If you don't have exactly 3 or 4 sentences, I'm not going to mark you off or anything like that, because that's not a rule in writing. I just give this number because usually 3 to 4 sentences is enough space to begin having thorough and specific analysis. You may need way more than 4 sentences, and that's totally fine. For other examples, you may only need 2 sentences to make the point, and that's fine too. So again, this is not a rule, but this is the starting place to keep in mind, okay? And remember, this is for each analysis. So example 1, about 3 to 4 sentences for just example 1. Example 2, about 3 to 4 sentences of analysis for just example 2, and so on, okay? So if you do it this way, you shouldn't really have to worry about, will I reach the page length for the essay? Because, I remember being a student and stressing out about, will I meet the page length? That's always kind of a scary requirement, right? Is what the page length is. And I totally empathize with that. That's why I like TEAL, because keeping this in mind and knowing like, okay, this comes after every example. And before I get to the analysis, I have to contextualize the example and describe it and make it really specific. And then I'll go into really specific analysis, about 3 to 4 sentences long, and you'll repeat that process. It's basically going to guarantee that you'll have no trouble meeting the page length. Does that make sense? So that's why I recommend this to students. Okay, and then at the very end, you'll link back to the thesis. The linking back to the thesis should also be about 3 to 4 sentences, okay, just to start. Okay, so practice this, keep it in mind when you work on draft 1 and draft 2 for the conferences next week. Practice this. And I'm always here to talk about this in office hours or in our conferences, and I will bring it up again in class, but also feel free to email me if you have questions about this, okay? And always feel free to reference this video. It's going to go in the Beach Board forums for mini lessons on rhetoric and composition. All right.